Yeah, thank you very much. I'm honored to speak a little bit about an attack that we found on the SSH protocol. And to start things off, this is actually based on a research paper that we published. I, with my colleagues Markus Brinkmann and Jörg Schwenk, will appear in the Usenix Security Symposium this year. But if you're already familiar with the paper, I would like to shuffle things a little bit up and tell you a little tale. What? Now, so let's imagine we have a system administrator, we will call him Bob, and Bob is working for a company and is responsible for maintaining two servers. One we will call serve-prod01, which is a production level server, and another one, serve-test01, which is a test level server. As per common use, Bob uses the SSH protocol to connect to those servers. He does have sudo rights on the servers, so he has full control over the servers. Now, one day, the company hires a new employee, a trainee, which we call Mallory. As a trainee, he does not get access to the production level servers. He only gets access to the test level and only without sudo rights. So Mallory is not the nice kind of guy. He is eager to access the production level server. And to do this, he makes it rather simple. He installs himself a network tab at the computer of Bob to gain man-in-the-middle privileges on all of the connection that Bob initializes. And with this story in mind, I would like to start with a brief demonstration of a normal workday for Bob. And now I will try to switch to my demo. Perfect. Okay, so first of all, we have to start our servers. For this demo, we will run them as Docker containers. Now what you can see here is that we have now two Docker containers running. Both of those Docker containers are accepting incoming TCP connections on port 22. And they are running async SSH. Many of you might not be familiar with async SSH. Async SSH is a Python implementation for SSH. And why this is important that we do use the async SSH implementation, you will see in just a bit. For the client, I will also use async SSH, but I have made a little wrapper script which actually runs the async SSH client. So it's just a convenience script that I do not have to type this whole lines all the time. So let's start and connect to the production level server as Bob. And of course, he has chosen a super secure password called secret. And if we do so, we see that we get a normal shell. You can ignore the warnings for now. If we check who am I, we'll see that I'm Bob. And if we run the same command with sudo rights, we can also see that Bob does indeed have sudo rights on this container. Now the same is true if we now connect to the test server. Can once again call whoami, we'll get Bob, and we can also run sudo whoami, and we will see that we have root access to this container. Okay, up until this point, Mallory has not yet messed with the connection made by Bob. We will now introduce Mallory to the connection, and we will do this by introducing him in a TCP proxy. So to keep things simple, we will now connect to the TCP proxy, but the SSH client is actually configured to only trust the actual SSH server's public key. So there's no way that we could simply emulate another SSH server and proxy all those, but we can only proxy at the TCP level here. Now, if we now connect using the tab proxy, and we once again, oh no. Of course, it doesn't work. It's always the same with these machines. Back at it. Okay. So let's see if we now connect. The only thing that we can immediately see is that it takes a little bit longer to connect here. But we get the same shell that we are used to. We can, once again, ask for sudo rights. And we can see we get root access. But wait, what's that? Here's another password prompt, another sudo password prompt. And this is kind of strange. So why exactly do we have additional prompts that were not there before, although we simply connected over the tab network controller? Okay, let me tell you what happened here. So what you can see here is actually an attempt from Mallory to interfere with the connection. What happened here is that while you see at the bottom the prompt Bob at SRE test 01, it's not actually Bob that's logged in, but Mallory. So if I would be able to type in who am I with the account that I'm currently logged in, you would see that we are currently logged in as Mallory and not Bob, as we would expect. Now, how is this possible? Well, for the shell, it's pretty easy. You can customize the PS1 variable to obtain your custom prompt. Then you write a little alias for the sudo command, and you get to that level that we have here. But how did Mallory actually authenticate Bob into his account in the first place? Because usually the SSH protocol should protect against this kind of attack. And this is what I would like you to learn within the next 30 minutes. So how was Mallory actually available or able to mess with the authentication that Bob made against the server, the client authentication? Also, I will talk a little bit about what variants are there for the attack. What requirements do we have? And also, last but not least, how Bob can protect himself against the attack. Beyond that, I will talk just a little bit about how modern cryptography can break older protocols when it's introduced into the protocol, and also how we handled this protocol level responsible disclosure. Now, I know most of you will have some experience with the SSH protocol. Most of you certainly will have used it to connect to a server, manage a server, and so on. But I am pretty sure that not all of you are familiar with how the SSH protocol actually works. And this is what I would like you to learn first. So to understand the attack that Mallory did here, it's pretty important to first understand how the SSH protocol is structured and how it works. So SSH is built on top of the TCP/IP protocol stack, and is split into 3 sub-protocols. On the lowest level, we have the so-called Transport Layer Protocol, or TLP for short, and it in itself is structured into the Binary Packet Protocol, which is similar to the TLS record layers. Some of you are familiar with it. And we have the SSH key exchange, which negotiates the algorithms and the key material that is going to be used by the Binary Packet Protocol. On top of that, we have the authentication protocol. The authentication protocol does a little bit less than the name suggests. It does only do client authentication. So it does not perform server authentication. This is actually part of the Transport Layer Protocol. But the authentication protocol solely focuses on client authentication. This means that you can find password authentication, public key authentication, host-based authentication, keyboard, interactive. All of those methods are part of the authentication protocol. And last but not least, we have the connection protocol, which is the application layer protocol of SSH, where you basically can find all the neat stuff that SSH offers, so not only the remote shells, but, for example, port forwarding and stuff like this. We will, for the next few minutes, focus on the Transport Layer Protocol and a little bit on the authentication protocol. We do not need the connection protocol at all for this attack to work. So how does SSH client actually connect to a server? So let's assume Bob and the server already have a working TCP connection set up. So we're gonna not display that here. The first thing that we have is called a version exchange. Simple ASCII messages to signal that the client and the server both support the same version of SSH. You can also see there's a little bit more information than just the SSH version contained within this message. Depending on your actual implementation, you will get a lot of information sent within this version exchange. Next step is that client and server will send over lists of algorithms. The SSH protocol negotiates these algorithms by using a deterministic algorithm. So based on these two lists, the client and the server now know whether or not they can actually negotiate keys and speak SSH, and if so, which algorithms they are going to use. We also have what is denoted as NS and NC here, nonces that ensure that each session has a decent amount of randomness to it. And let's assume we have a Diffie-Hellman key exchange here, and the Diffie-Hellman key exchange in SSH is rather plain, so there's nothing special going on. The only thing that we have here is that the server, alongside its ephemeral public key, sends a long-term public key, PKS, which is often also referred to as the host key, as well as a signature that is actually computed using this, the private key that corresponds to this public key. Now, the signature is computed over the previous message fields, but something that come in handy later, this signature is only computed over a fixed subset of message fields. So keep that in mind, because we will later introduce some optional messages to this handshake, and those optional messages are not actually being signed by the server here. Of course, the reason for the signature in the first place is to authenticate the handshake and the server against the client. If, for whatever reason, an attacker would mess with the connection, alter the signature, or the signature becomes invalid, then the client would be able to detect this and terminate the connection. Now, client and server do have keys available now, so they signal with a simple byte that they will now use these keys, and after this, they will now communicate in an encrypted way. For the remainder of this talk, I will denote the separation between the unencrypted context and the encrypted context by a dashed line. So everything that is above the dashed line is unencrypted, and unauthenticated, at least on the message level. And everything below this line is now sent in an encrypted way. So the part that remains is that now the client or server may send some extensions, and then at some point the client will request a service from the server, in this case the SSH user authentication or authentication protocol, and the server usually accepts this request and they will now continue to run the authentication protocol. Now a common attack type that we have in SSH or in cryptographic network protocols in general are replay attacks. So how does the SSH protocol actually prevent replay attacks? That is, for example, we take the extension info message, the encrypted extension info message, and send it at a later date and see whether or not this still works. SSH uses sequence numbers to prevent this. It's a rather straightforward concept. So Bob and the server both keep track of how many messages they have sent and received. And if we now send over a message from the server to the client, we will actually increment those sequence numbers. Note that the sequence numbers are not transmitted within the message itself. This is not necessary. We are using reliable transport. There's no way something could be reordered by the transport layer. So every reordering here has to happen because of an attack. So we now increment it after we've sent the message. And of course, if we now send a message back, that is from the client to the server, we'll of course increment the client's send counter and the server's receive counter. Now, let's briefly assume that at this point, what we are looking at were the new keys messages, and we have a separation between the unencrypted context above the line and the encrypted context below the line. The SSH protocol does not care. So sequence numbers are never reset to 0 within the protocol. So they are initialized to 0 at the beginning and then simply incremented as long as they don't overflow. And yeah. That means if we now send another message here, this will actually be verified through a MAC. So we will now use these sequence numbers to actually verify that the message is sent in order. And we do this by putting the sequence number into our MAC or message authentication code that we compute for each message to ensure that it is not altered. And the server will compute this MAC as well using its receive counter. And as long as send and receive counter for a single message are in sync, the message is accepted. Of course, we will increment the send and receive counter afterwards. Now let's put this idea of sequence numbers into the protocol. As you can see here, the protocol version exchange itself does not get any sequence numbers. Just plain ASCII messages, nothing special there. The first message to receive a sequence number is the kex init message sent by both client and server. And you can also see that every message sent in an unencrypted context does not have its sequence number validated. So there's no way in the unencrypted context, because sequence numbers are not transmitted, there's no way that the server or client could check whether or not their sequence number is correct for a message. They are only able to check the sequence numbers as soon as we switch over to the encrypted protocol, and at this point, they will input it in the MAC computation and verify. Now, I will have to sum up a few things here, just to put a little bit more space at the bottom. Fear not, everything's still there. So how does user authentication work? It's rather simple in the SSH protocol. It's a simple challenge response, or the client can choose whatever authentication request it likes. It will simply try to authenticate itself. So for this, in this example, we will use password authentication. We will put a Bob secret as our authentication, and we will then get either a user authentication success message, which signals that the authentication was indeed successful, or we will get a user authentication failure, which means that the client has to try another method of authentication. Now that's all regarding the normal protocol flow. There's nothing special going on here, but we had the question, how can Mallory actually mess with this protocol flow? So the ultimate goal of Mallory is to actually inject his own authentication request into the connection. So if we now introduce Mallory to the connection, and this would be what Mallory wants. Obviously, this is not possible because everything below the dashed line is encrypted. Mallory has no access to it. So he cannot simply insert his own messages into the encrypted connection state. But what he can do is actually try to do it a little bit earlier. So he can simply try to authenticate himself ahead of time. So before we even switch on the encrypted connection part. Of course, rather obvious, this would terminate the connection as soon as the key exchange finishes because we have this sequence number mismatch. You can see the extension info message sent by Bob is sent under sequence number 3, is received under sequence number 4 by the server, which will then consequently cause a MAC failure and cause the connection to terminate. Now, Mallory tries to fix this, and he has the idea that he could potentially remove one message that is sent by the client so that it is never actually seen by the server, thus not incrementing the receive counter. There's only one message that he could potentially remove in this connection without causing the connection to stall, and this is the extension info message. As you can see here, if we remove this extension info message that caused our connection to terminate, we can simply realign our sequence numbers and the verification of the MAC succeeds. So this is a rather easy idea that we have here. We'll talk a little bit about under which conditions this does work. But now Mallory observes that he gets the user success message a little bit earlier because this authentication success message is now a direct response to his authentication request message. There's a simple solution to that. Mallory could simply rearrange this message, so delay it just a little bit, that it seems like a response to the authentication request by Bob. Now you might ask, what happens to the authentication request sent by Bob? Nothing. The SSH protocol allows you to send a bunch of different authentication requests in parallel, and it says the first is good, and if authentication succeeds, you forget about everything else and send nothing in response. So what went actually wrong here? We have the Lex server state machine, of course. This is obviously an implementation flaw. The server is not supposed to accept user authentication ahead of time. But it did, as you have seen. Another problem that allowed us to exploit this implementation flaw in a man-in-the-middle scenario was that the signature that is used to authenticate the handshake and the server is not computed over all messages during the handshake, but only this fixed subset of messages. Therefore, it does not cover, for example, the user authentication request sent by Mallory, so it is not detected. And last but not least, also the continuation of sequence numbers across the different encryption contexts also allowed us to manipulate the sequence number within the encrypted context by or other way around, the sequence numbers in the unencrypted context could be manipulated by the sequence numbers in the encrypted context. Okay, now this is a rather specific attack. It only works against async SSH, and but this is a very interesting attack idea. So let's talk about some attack variants that we found. So the most obvious attack would be to simply replace our user authentication request with any SSH message you want. As long as it's accepted by the server, this would work. So we could, for example, introduce our own extension info message, so negotiate extensions with the server. For example, we could say that we do not support SSH SHA-2 authentication for users. Up until now, we only focused that we would like to insert a message into the connection. And we removed this extension info message inside the secret channel for the sole purpose of realigning the sequence numbers. But we can also turn things around. So if we insert a message, which we call ignore, which actually exists in the SSH protocol, so there is a message that is designed to be ignored, we could offset the sequence numbers ahead of time and then remove a according number of messages within the secret channel. And this is the key idea of our attack, because the SSH protocol usually tries to protect against this kind of attack. So it should not be possible that the client and the server have different transcripts from the secret channel. Of course, this is limited to only the first message in the connection. If we try to remove another message further down in the connection, we would actually cause either a verification failure because we verified at an inconsistent state, or we cause the connection to stale. Note that this attack pattern that we see here does not require any implementation flaw. So you can run this attack as long as you implement SSH according to specification. Now let's talk a little bit about what requirements we have. Because it's not that simple to remove a message from the encrypted connection state. Removing a message could potentially cause trouble within the connection because maybe the subsequent messages decryption depend on the first encrypted message. And we categorized all of those different encryption modes that we found in the SSH protocol and tried to determine whether or not we could actually remove the first message without causing a connection failure. We did this by looking at the state of the encryption at each step. So we tried to analyze what kind of variables make up the state of the encryption. For example, in the SSH poly 1305, we found that only the sequence numbers are part of the encryption state. And we have seen we could manipulate these sequence numbers, and therefore we could perfectly exploit the SSH poly 1305 algorithm. Now on the different side of the spectrum, we have GCM. GCM uses a counter that we cannot access as an attacker, at least in not any way that we know of, and is therefore not affected by our attack. There are modes, namely encrypt endmake and encrypt denmake, that are only partially controllable by an attacker. We have the sequence number in there, but we also have either an IV or a counter value. And for those, it heavily depends on the internal workings of the algorithms. We found that for encrypt endmake, we were not able to perform our attack, but for the encrypt denmake, we were able to successfully attack the implementation with a certain percentage. So just to give you some numbers, the encrypt denmake CVC, we had up to 80% success rate, so rather high. Now you could say we have 50-50, we have the encrypt NMAC and SSH 20poly1305 that are some attack worthy. We have the encrypt NMAC and GCM, which are not affected by our attack. But if you actually look at the usage of those algorithms, you will find that SSH 20poly1305 and encrypt NMAC modes are among the most common encryption modes that there are. This is not only because SSH 20poly1305 is a modern algorithm, but especially because the OpenSSH implementation favors SSH 20poly1305 for a few years now. So whenever you use OpenSSH, you connect to an SSH server that actually supports SSH 20poly1305, you will be using SSH 20poly1305, allowing for this attack to take place. Now, we have talked about what this attack is all about. We have seen what variants there are, what requirements we have. Now let's talk about what we can actually do to protect ourselves against the attack. So we made a few suggestions. So the most obvious one would be to simply reset sequence numbers and to authenticate the entire handshake transcript. Reset sequence numbers, pretty obvious. It decouples the sequence numbers from the unencrypted context and the encrypted context, therefore removing the attacker's capability to manipulate sequence numbers across different encryption contexts. This is not sufficient. We will need also authenticated handshake transcripts, because if we authenticate the entire handshake transcript, we could detect the message injection during the handshake. OpenSSH, to our report, developed a countermeasure which they called strict key exchange, or strict KEX for short. And strict key exchange is part of our suggestion. So they do actually reset sequence numbers, but on the other side, they do not authenticate the entire handshake transcript, but they went for an easier way, at least for them. They simply said, we do not allow any message that is not strictly required for the key exchange to succeed within the key exchange. Can't see why this could go wrong in some implementations, but here we are. So strict KEX is actually the de facto standard to mitigate Terrapin nowadays. So we have over 30 vendors that support strict KEX as a protocol extension. And if you look, for example, on Shodan, you will find that roughly 11 million servers nowadays on the public IP address range run some kind of strict key exchange. Now, how did we get there? So we started in October, and we first contacted OpenSSH and async SSH. OpenSSH, obviously, it's the most common SSH implementation there is. You may recall from the Secure Shells and Shambles yesterday the huge importance of the OpenSSH implementation. And we also contacted async SSH because of the implementation bugs in their state machine. Now, async SSH fixed their implementation bugs in November, and this was done. So no implementation bugs at async SSH, but the protocol vulnerability remained. Our idea was OpenSSH should develop countermeasure. We will take this countermeasure with a patch for OpenSSH and provide it to all other SSH implementation vendors. Because as a protocol level countermeasure, we need this countermeasure to be implemented across a multitude of different SSH implementations. And this worked out just fine. So OpenSSH said they would like to disclose within a month. So we said, yeah, we will take the month. And we had our public disclosure in December. And at this point, I would like to thank everyone that was involved for the smooth, responsible disclosure. Now, what have we seen in the last 30 minutes? Well, Terrapin is a novel kind of attack. It targets the SSH channel integrity, which is a rather rare attack. Usually, you are interested in for whatever reason, trying to access the connection contents itself. And of course, we could exploit this in practice to downgrade, for example, user authentication, and this does not require any implementation flaw. However, the more impactful part of our attack is that it actually does allow exploitation of certain man-in-the-middle or certain implementation flaws as man-in-the-middle attacks. We also have seen that encryption modes that are affected are widely spread. So we have CHA-20, poly1305, and CTR CBC ciphers along encrypt then make algorithms. Last but not least, strict CACs is a protocol level countermeasure. So as such, it requires support from both client and server. And this is the one thing that I would like you to remember. Not only patch your servers, but also, if you haven't done already, patch your SSH client, especially if you are using OpenSSH under Windows, because they do not deliver this update over Windows Update. And with this, I would like to conclude my talk. And we do have some 3 minutes for questions, if there are any.
Thank you for the talk. How are specification issues being addressed?
What? Can you repeat it?
How are specification issues being addressed, possibly with RFCs?
Yeah, so he asked how the specification flaws are addressed. So we did this using the strict CACs countermeasure. The problem is that currently the SSH protocol community does not have a working group at the IETF, so there are no standardization efforts to the SSH protocol. But instead, most of the progress in SSH is done over or by OpenSSH. So they simply implement it, everyone else will follow their recommendation, and they call it a standard. That's basically what's happening to the SSH protocol. Yeah, if you do have any questions later on, you can always find me on via email or on X or Mastodon. So just let me know when you have any questions.